Welcome to Dad Talk Today. My name is Eric Carroll, and we have an amazing show lined up for you. We are fighting for fathers all across the United States and all across the world where you can be glad to be dad. Stick around, guys. Dad Talk Today is about to begin. Hey everybody, welcome to Dad Talk Today. We got a special episode lined up for you. We're going to be talking about the domestic violence industry. And I got a special guest, Mr. Edward Bartlett. Ed, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Doing good, man. So Ed, tell everybody a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, well, I'm the president of the Coalition to End Domestic Violence. We're based in the Washington, D.C. area. We're a policy organization, so we're trying to fix the broken domestic violence laws. And I've been at this for now over 15 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah, man. So when I told everybody I had a domestic violence organization, I think most of them looked like a deer in the headlights. Like, what are you doing? And I was like, nah, I talked to these guys. They got some really good stuff coming out here. I've read some of your studies. It's got some amazing insights going on. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the domestic violence industry, though, Ed.
Well, be glad to. So we need to understand that there's a big difference between science and ideology. And most of what passes as domestic violence facts really are based on science. So why don't we start by talking about what that ideology really is? The ideology goes back to the feminist theory of patriarchy. And if you haven't, if you're not real familiar with that, what patriarchy means is that it's a, quote, a system of society in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. Well, the concept is so far-flung and ridiculous that it's easy to refute it. For example, and I'll just give you one example. So in every country around the world, men have a shorter lifespan than women. But in almost every country around the world, there are programs devoted to helping to women's health, but usually few or no programs devoted to men's health. Now, if there really was a patriarchy that was driving all of these governments around the world, wouldn't you see a whole lot of focus on men's health and maybe just a little bit better balance between men's health and women's health? That's one example. I could give you many other examples, but feminists have taken this patriarchy theory and turned it into the entire basis for the domestic violence industry. And this is how the concept works. So feminists claim, they don't really provide any evidence, but they just say this, that there's a power differential between men and women that of course favors men. That's what they say. And in order to uphold that power, men utilize domestic violence or the threat of domestic violence to uphold that patriarchal power and control. That's the theory. Now, whenever you're ready, I'll tell you about the science, but I want everybody to understand that's the ideology we're dealing with.
Oh, absolutely. I'm ready for it, Ed. Go ahead and tell us about it. I've been looking forward to this, guys. If you got some questions for Ed while he's doing this, put them down in the comments and I'll bring them to it. But tell us about the science there, Ed.
All right. So the science I'm going to tell you about comes from the United States Centers for Disease Control, which is not too far from where you are right now in Atlanta, Georgia. And they do a survey. It's called the NISVS. If you're really interested, I'll tell you what those letters stand for. But the NISVS is actually the gold standard in knowing, well, what is the extent of domestic violence? What are the dynamics? Which groups have the highest rates and all that good stuff? So let's cut to the chase. The NISVS consistently shows that men are more likely to be victims of domestic violence than women, and not by just a couple percentage points. Okay, we're talking about every year 4.2 million men victims of domestic violence compared to 3.5 female victims. 4.2 million compared to 3.5 million. That's the science of domestic violence.
You guys heard that. That was a statistic you told me a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, that's something people need to know. But society doesn't seem to reflect that. I'm curious, why don't you ever see a man on a billboard? Domestic violence organizations claim they want to do away with domestic violence, and you've got all this that's happening to men. You never see them on a billboard. You don't see any men's domestic violence shelters. If there are, they're very few and far between. Why aren't they addressing this on both sides?
Because this is an industry driven by ideology. It is not driven by science. And that's maybe the most important point I want to make during this interview is we are dealing with an ideology that's driven by multiple millions of federal funding to keep that ideology and keep that narrative going. So that's partly why we're having this campaign. The campaign is called "Tell the Truth About Domestic Violence," and you may know that there's October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, so we're actually leading up to Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
Yep. So I've heard this from a few people. I'm going to get you to go over this, Ed. I'm sure you have before too. Mr. Todd Ashley said lesbian relationships have the highest percentage of violence, no men involved. Is that true?
It's exactly true. And again, that comes from the NISVS. And since you've just raised it, I'm going to tell you the actual numbers. Okay. I hope you've got your seatbelt on right now.
Okay.
The rate of lesbian lifetime incidents of domestic violence, rape, or stalking is 44%. In other words, almost half of all lesbians have at least once in their lifetime experienced sexual assault, rape, or stalking, compared to male gay couples, 26%. 44%, 26%. That's the difference. And both of those numbers, by the way, are higher than heterosexual couples.
Wow. Man. So Jennifer Mahalik here on YouTube said, what definition is being used for those stats? How do they define domestic violence?
Yeah, good question, Jennifer. Well, in this survey, the NISVS, they simply have a series of questions. In the past year, were you slapped by your intimate partner? Did your intimate partner throw anything at you? Did your intimate partner threaten you with a knife or a gun? They're very specific questions. So they just aggregate the answers to all these questions and came up with an answers I just gave you.
Yeah. You know, so when I very first started Dad Talk, I was talking about parental alienation, the family court, some of the stuff that was going on. I myself have never received allegations of sexual abuse or physical abuse or any of that. So when somebody would bring it up to me, I kind of went in the other direction, not because I didn't want to help them, but because I never want to be seen. You know, there's always two sides to every story. I don't ever want to be seen as helping out somebody that's done something like this.
Right.
I started getting my inbox flooded with these guys that was telling me they was going through these false allegations. And I said, at some point, I've got to do something about this, because if I was going through that, I'd want somebody to help me as well. And
right.
This is just completely out of hand. I hear of tons of them every day. What percentage are we looking at with these domestic violence stats? Where does false allegations come in there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually a survey was done just a few months ago. It was done by a group called YouGov, and YouGov is sort of one of the leading public opinion poll companies in the country. And again, I hope you've got your seatbelt on. I'm going to tell you the actual rate. So 11% of all men, of all American men, said they had been falsely accused of domestic violence, sexual assault, or child abuse. So 11% of men we're talking about, we're over 10 million American men have been falsely accused. That's a lot of people.
That is a lot of, people. And, it's crazy. I had the father earlier this year. He had been accused of rape and physical abuse. He was completely exonerated. They had video to show you didn't do any of the things he was accused of. When he went to pick up his children in the parking lot, he was shot and killed by his ex-father-in-law. And it just goes to show you just how bad these allegations and how ugly this can get. I'm curious though, with family court and these false allegations, how they are just completely going out. How do you think family court is attached to the domestic violence industry?
Well, we have to think of the domestic violence establishment as an octopus. And that octopus has extended its tentacles into almost every segment of our society. Extended it into schools, extended it into the criminal justice system, into civil court, into family court, even into immigration. Immigration law is affected by the Violence Against Women Act. So yeah, don't there. If you're looking for an example of a ideology that really has gained hold and exerts enormous influence on our society, this patriarchal theory of patriarchal power and control, that's it.
All right, so I'm glad you brought that up. A lot of people are not familiar with VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. What is it, and what are some of the consequences that we've had since that's came into law?
Sure. So the Violence Against Women Act was, first of all, it was championed by then Senator Joe Biden, and he was the guy that kind of made it happen back in the early 1990s, and it was in 1994 when Violence Against Women Act, we call it VAWA, was actually passed both the Senate and the House and was signed into law by. So VAWA basically is designed to gear up the criminal justice system. Think of the criminal justice system on steroids. So it was designed to increase the number of restraining orders, increase the number of arrests, increase the number of prosecutions, and increase the number of incarcerations. And you may have heard the term mass incarceration, and how this is especially a problem for African American men. Well, guess what? A lot of this problem of mass incarceration traces back to the Violence Against Women Act.
Right. I tell you, this just completely blows my mind. I know we also got the Duluth model. Could you explain the Duluth model? That's something I need a little bit more education on. I've heard some of the things inside of the Duluth model and what's being used. It's been taught in the family law industry for a very long time, and more people need to know about it. I figured you could probably explain it better than anybody.
Sure. So the Duluth model was invented by a group of feminists based in, you guessed it, Duluth, Minnesota. And it's a wheel that has several spokes to the wheel, and the most important spoke of the wheel says male privilege. In other words, it's saying that, again, we're back to this ideology that it's thanks to male privilege that women suffer abuse. Well, it doesn't say anything about female privilege. This is pure ideology we're talking about. It's obviously very controversial because it's not based on science.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, do you know around a roundabout figure on how much these organizations are getting in grants and money every year from the government?
So, so the overall VAWA law right now is authorized for $500 million. That's $500 million. It keeps going up, a little bit, $1 million here, $1 million there. Soon you're talking about real money. So it's right now it's $500 million, but it's important to realize that's only one of the laws, federal laws, that's driving this. There's also another law called the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. That sends a lot of money to abuse shelters. And then when you look at specific sectors, for example, in the Department of Defense, there's a very active domestic violence program within the Department of Defense. There's another one within the Veterans Administration. So on and on and on. There are many different places where money is fed into this ideology.
Yeah, that's crazy. I had a guest on earlier this year. He was in the Navy. His wife had been beating him, had been beating their child. He went to a domestic violence shelter not once, 5 times, and they turned him down and said he could not come because he was a man. Yeah, this is one of our service members. And
correct.
I mean, just hearing stories like that burns me up. I mean, why would you turn him down if he's going through it just like everybody else?
Right. And of course, in this country, we do have sex discrimination laws, but it's pretty astonishing how easily domestic violence groups ignore these sex discrimination laws, like the example you just shared. I believe there's 2,000 abuse shelters around the country. Maybe that's a little bit high, but the point is, out of all of the abuse shelters, only 2 of them that I know of serve male victims, as a person who's actually allowed to go inside of the shelter.
I wonder what the funding for those look like. I bet it's much different on the other side.
Funding for those 2 shelters, I honestly don't know the exact source of funding, but they're generally not enjoying the fairly generous inflow from the VAWA law.
Yeah, speaking of funding, I'm going to pull this up on the screen right here. I was just talking to Ed about this before we came on. Now, I mean, I got to search a little bit more into this, but this just happened a couple of weeks ago, guys. Governor Ron DeSantis announces more than $5 million settlement with Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence following recent lawsuit. He brought this to light. From what I hear, they was getting government funds. The lady that was running it, I think it was year before last, got 260 days of vacation time.
Right. Yeah. The Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence is sort of let's call them a long-term serial offender. I've actually been following the situation in Florida for about 10 years. I actually visited an abuse shelter in one of the towns in northern Florida, and actually I got to know one of the former abuse shelter employees, and the stories she told me were pretty hair-raising about child abuse going on in the shelters, lack of appropriate supervision, inappropriate use of funds, abuse shelters getting contributions for this and that, but those contributions of say personal hygiene items, those items never got to the shelter residents. They were somehow ended up in the pockets of the shelter employees. I mean, she just regaled me with almost endless stories of these pretty serious abuses of what was going on in the Florida shelter. So when this story came along last year, I really wasn't totally surprised.
What are some other stories you've heard like that, Ed? What's going on around the rest of the country? We know this just isn't Florida.
It's not just Florida. I'll give an example here in Maryland, where we're located. There was an abuse shelter in Prince George's County that had plenty of funding, government funding, but it was so poorly managed that there were literally mice running around in the shelter, and it was so unhygienic that the residents of the shelter began to complain to the Washington Post, and they actually closed down the shelter because it really was such a disaster zone for people to stay. The Department of Justice actually does audits of VAWA grantees to make sure they're using the money the way it's supposed to. And and it's done by the Office of the Inspector General, and every few months there's another report of a like there was one I just read recently of a bookkeeper of a abuse shelter, I believe in Minnesota, who was pilfering the funds and embezzling the funds, and so she was prosecuted by the Department of Justice and found guilty. So those stories happen a lot more than you would kind of suspect.
In your opinion, do you think one of the reasons that they're not showing how much this happens to men is they're afraid of losing some of that funding?
Well, I think it's less financial and more ideological. You know, I mean, remember, this
Okay.
ideology is so powerful, and let's be honest, it's so irrational. So, I mean, for example, they don't even define what patriarchy is. Um, so, much less do they give any evidence that it really exists. But it's a visceral ideology that is driven, you know, by fear, by emotion. And we also need to be honest, it's driven by male chivalry. There are many male lawmakers who basically buy into the ideology because of chivalry. And I don't think we can pretend that's not happening.
Oh no, you know, that's one of the things I tell guys all the time, even with this show and the problems that a lot of these men are going through. You'd be shocked. Most of the, you know, the bad things that they are hearing is from other men. You know, other men are telling them just to man up, just to get over it. Stop whining. You know, it's no big deal. Pay your child support. Get over it. You know, let her have the kids. You see them every other weekend. I'm like, guys, this is their kids that they're fighting for. You know, but men can be some of the harder on men than anybody else. You know, and that really shocked me. That really shocked me. It's not
Oh,
only do we not have resources, but a lot of times they don't have the support.
absolutely, yeah. And so I don't think we can downplay the role of chivalry. I would call it misguided chivalry or misplaced chivalry. Chivalry, I think, is a good thing when it's in the personal, private context. But when it becomes the basis that drives policy, that's where you have problems.
Yeah. David Murray here on Facebook said, I'd like to hear his opinion on the American Psychological Association having several sources of feminism within their website.
Yeah, David, can you be a little bit more specific? Because the APA is such a large organization with many different divisions. So I think I just need a little bit more information to respond intelligently.
Yep. Tempest63 on YouTube said, if more men came out and opened up about being abused, would you see any change?
Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. Because the issue of abused men has been swept under the rug for a variety of reasons. You know, men don't want to admit many cases that they have been abused. Men may not feel comfortable asking for help. But it's not just that. It's also when men do, you know, call the Domestic Violence Hotline, they may be treated with skepticism. They may be ridiculed. In some cases, the police may treat the abused men as the offender, not the victim. So this is a complicated. You know, this is sort of the onion. We need to peel off the layers of the onion. But absolutely yes, if more abused men would speak out, yes, have a big impact on the debate.
Now, I've heard a little bit in the rumor mill. I don't know how much truth there is to it, but I hear that they're wanting to do some more additions to VAWA. Is this true?
Oh, absolutely, because like any ideology, the ideology feeds on itself. So they're always trying to grow and expand and create new tentacles for this ideology. And I'll tell you what that new tentacle is. So, of course, when you and I say domestic violence, you think of something that's physical, right?
Right.
Well, but let's go back again to the ideology. It's about power and control. So now the idea is and it's called coercive control laws. And the idea is to say that anytime a person exerts any kind of influence, like psychological abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, technological abuse, that people are actually trying to turn that into a legal offense. That's already happened in Connecticut, California, and Hawaii. So they're trying to do that at the federal level. That's exactly what I described to you: emotional, psychological, financial, technological. Those terms are now in the VAWA bill that was approved in the House of Representatives in March. Now, we are fighting like the Dickens to stop that from happening in anything in the Senate. Knock on wood, I'm hopeful it will be successful.
How is that coming along? Are you getting much support while you're fighting that?
Well, yes, it tends to be sort of sub rosa. Legislators don't, I mean, this narrative is so powerful that legislators don't want to stand up, and wave a flag and say, you know what, all of this is based on ideology, it's not based on science. Well, they know that, cancel culture will come after them very quickly. But behind the scenes, we get a lot of support from staffers, and these are staffers we've worked with over the years, and they understand that, yeah, there are, we have the problem with false allegations. We have the problem of male victims who are being turned away. I mean, I could kind of go on and on. So yes, we are making inroads.
So, that's crazy, because we have two very well known, I'll keep their name out of this, because they were speaking out about these injustices and men's and fathers issues. They were Democratic candidates. And later on, they said they had to stop because they was told by their party that they're going to alienate themselves from their feminist base.
Right. Yeah. Well, and honestly, that doesn't surprise me. It saddens me that, that lawmakers would be, intellectually dishonest. And that is what's happening to some extent.
Oh, definitely. Half of our legislators are attorneys. I mean, guys, just, follow the money is all I can say. Ed, tell us about some of the other things, some of the other changes you guys are trying to get. I'm not particularly completely familiar with all you guys are doing. It looks like you've been doing a lot of great work, and that's why I wanted to bring you on here and let everybody know, please get behind this organization and give them some support. Get these statistics, that study when it comes out. We got to make sure that we spread it everywhere. But what are some of the changes you guys are trying to get?
Well, fundamentally, we're trying to tame the very strong criminal response that's just baked into the Violence Against Women Act. I'll give you one example. So the original VAWA bill had a whole section called mandatory arrest. Now, if you know anything about the Constitution, there's a key part of one of the Bill of Rights talks about probable cause. Well, when you're dealing with a multi-million law that says mandatory arrest, the whole concept of probable cause kind of gets downplayed, if not thrown out the window altogether. And so these mandatory arrest policies are widespread around the country, and we think it is causing causing serious problems. And I'll tell you why. Because if we're talking about somebody, and I'll give you an example. Just yesterday in the news, the New York Post had a story about a woman who shot her husband multiple times and killed him. I'll just read you the headline if you want to search it. Texas wife charged with murder after husband shot multiple times. This ran in yesterday's New York Post. So that's a case where, yeah, the criminal justice system needs to take action, needs to respond. That's what the criminal system is for. But then let's take another sort of at the other extreme. Earlier, I gave the example of the one-time slap on a face and being and a shove back. I don't think that. Yep, there's the article. Yeah, it's pretty. That article is pretty gruesome, and it exemplifies the problem right there.
I'll put the link in the chat, guys.
Yeah. So, but let's take the other extreme. We're not talking about a homicide or even threatening somebody with a gun. We're just talking. We're talking about a one-time slap, a one-time shove with no injuries. Well, you know, I think it's a little bit of overkill to throw both of those people in jail. Now, I'm not saying we should ignore it, but what I'm saying is that there's a role for mental health treatment. There's a role for alcohol treatment. There's a role for couples counseling that is largely ignored in these cases. Why? Because of mandatory arrest policies. So as a starter, we'd like to roll back, not eliminate, but we'd like to roll back on many of these mandatory arrest laws because it violates the Constitution, and it's not, actually some research shows that mandatory arrest increases domestic homicides because it actually, exacerbates and leads to retaliation.
Absolutely. I mean, in this country, we're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, but it seems like if you get an allegation against you of domestic violence, you're guilty until proven innocent.
Well, unfortunately, and I think you're exactly right. There is an environment. And again, it's this narrative. I don't want to over harp on this narrative, but it truly is the narrative because it says that this desire for dominance and control is baked into the psyche of men. It's hardwired into the DNA and the thinking of men. So what that's saying, what the implication of that is, well, if a man, just by virtue of a man, right there's sort of an air of suspicion, right? But if a man were to, let's just take an example, tell his wife to not overspend the bank account. Well, believe it or not, many in the domestic violence field would say, "Oh, that's financial abuse."
Right.
To not just say that, right? Well, all right, but here's again, if a man does that once, that means that he does have these quote patriarchal impulses, and so he's likely to escalate his abusive tendencies to the point of a brutal or horrendous outcome. Well, there's just no science in that, and we would never say a woman who uses the silence treatment, and the silence treatment, of course, is a form of psychological abuse. We would never say, well, that woman who, resorted to the silence treatment, she's a budding abuser, or she's likely to come back tomorrow with a shotgun and kill her husband. We would never say that. That's crazy. But that is the logic behind in the domestic violence establishment.
Ed, you're using something that I probably use like every show that I'm on. I've tried to beat this into the guys' heads, and I say that in a, not a literal sense.
No
when
pun
talking
intended,
about domestic
right?
violence. No pun
All right.
intended.
Okay.
All right. But you talk about the narrative. There's so many people that are focused on changing the laws. And I've said time and time again, guys, until we change the narratives, we've got an uphill battle with changing these laws. This narrative is so deadly. And I get a lot of flack sometimes for talking about some of the gender bias that goes on, not only in family court, but in the domestic violence industry. There is a gender bias. I mean, it shows very clearly. And that narrative, until we can change that, I fear that we're fighting a losing battle in many cases.
We absolutely have to change the narrative. I agree that it's the narrative that's driving so many of these laws. I'll give you an example, it's this coercive control idea. So this past fall, they were lobbying in Connecticut to pass a coercive control law. And to justify it, they would only say it was men who were engaging in coercive control. Whereas, again, we're going back to the CDC and back to the science. It's more often it's women who engage in coercive control. And let me actually give you the numbers here. So this is every year. There's 17.3 million male victims of coercive control. 17.3. Only 12.7 female victims of coercive control. That's almost a 50% greater rate of coercive control by females than males. But in this big campaign they had in Connecticut this past fall, nary a word about coercive control when women use it.
What are some of your ideas that we could do to change that narrative? Us as a collective group that watched this show that really wants to see the system change, what would be some of your suggestions?
Well, sure. Well, so coming up in October, it's called Domestic Violence Awareness Month. It's held every year, and it's an opportunity to get word out. So we are going to, and when I say we've created a coalition of over 10 different individuals and groups, and not just in the United States, in other countries as well, who will be, during the month of October, we'll be doing everything in our power to share the truth, the scientific truth of domestic violence. One of the ways we're going to do it is we have a new report coming out. It's called 30 Years of Domestic Violence, Half-Truths, Misrepresentations, and Lies. So the report will be coming out September the 20th.
How accepted do you think that's going to be by the people that don't want to hear it?
Well, I think we need to realize that the winds of change are on our side right now. And I'm going to give you one example. So I mentioned earlier about the mandatory arrest policies and how really bad they are and dysfunctional. Well, it's not just us that are saying that. Last summer, a group of 46 state domestic violence coalitions actually signed a statement. It was called a Moment of Truth. Moment of Truth. You can search for it on the website.
Okay.
Truth document. It's almost a confession that we realize that mandatory arrest and this overemphasis on prosecution has not worked, has failed us, especially in low-income communities, partly because the true victims never have stopped calling the police because they don't want their partner to be arrested. They want the abuse to stop, but they don't want their partner to be arrested. So in lower income communities, the victims don't call police anymore. And that realization is coming through.
What's the difference in the low income versus the upper class? Like, how much more is this happening?
It is higher in the lower income. Don't pin me down for numbers, but it is higher rates of domestic violence in lower income. It's not an issue of racial differences. It's a matter of income differences. And another very interesting fact is that people who are undergoing a divorce, separation and divorce, their risk of domestic violence is actually quite high. Yeah. Whereas people who are in a stable married relationship have domestic violence rates that are close to zero. So of course the irony here is domestic violence. The domestic violence ideology says that marriage is inherently oppressive to women, obviously because it involves a union with a man, and that somehow so through various ways they work to undermine stable marriages. Well, stable marriages, that's the safest place for a man or a woman to be in terms of not avoiding domestic violence.
Right. Yeah, I
There,
was going to ask you about that. When I was reading that study by YouGov, it definitely said most of the time this happens in a child custody dispute. So I mean, it's definitely tied right there together with the family law.
yeah, it's closely linked to it. I'm sure you've heard of parental alienation,
Oh
and
yeah.
and part of this, this is, yet another tentacle is to say that, you know, a divorce, a couple divorces, they have one or two children, and let's say the mother wants to sort of win the alliance, the allegiance of the children. So she may engage in what's called parental alienation, saying things like, "Oh, well, your daddy doesn't love you," or
Yeah.
things like that. So, so of course that's child abuse. I mean, there's no
Absolutely.
denying that is child abuse. But so the strategy that feminists use is to say, "Oh, no, that's not child abuse. That's the father was so abusive to his kids that they don't want to talk to him anymore." Well, sorry, that's hogwash. But that's how the ideology works and how they're trying to infiltrate the family court system.
Parental alienation is definitely child abuse. That's something that we've been, touring the country trying to tell the legislators about, and they've been really receptive to it. Not receptive in a legislative way. I'd like to see some more legislation going on. But one thing I think we can make some headway with, Ed, earlier this year, we was in Iowa. They let us set up in the middle of the Capitol, interview the reps and the senators. They got a bill in there for consequences against false allegations, which is, supposed to be against the law anyway. We see that it's very rarely punished. But a lot of these politicians are facing false allegations too. So I think it kind of sparked their ears a little bit. And I've been to a lot of the capitals and told people about this bill, and they would like to copy it. I think that would help. What about you?
Absolutely, absolutely. Anything we can do to publicize the existence of false allegations, and even more to impose sanctions.
Yeah.
You may have heard in New York State, they actually have a law on the book called Karen's Law, and it arose because there was this incident in Central Park between a white woman and a black man, and she started kind of, I think there was something with a barking dog, but she started accusing him of trying to assault her, and this was all caught on video. So bottom line is they actually passed a law in New York State. It's called Karen's Law, to impose sanctions on false accusers.
Yep. We should have had him a long time ago. So David's actually got a pretty good question right here. He said, is there anything with domestic violence that is tied in with how CPS responds that you know about? CPS is becoming a more growing concern every single day. I'm hearing from these parents. And I'm curious, have you seen any ties with CPS in the domestic violence industry?
Well, absolutely yes, because the narrative says that not only are men the major or the sole perpetrators of partner violence, uh, that narrative carries over to say men are the sole or primary perpetrators of child abuse. Well, again, that's not true. The science says that more often it's the mother, especially single mothers have um, definitely higher rates of child abuse than others. But obviously, again, it's a powerful narrative. It's repeated kind of endlessly. I told you about what just happened in Connecticut. I could tell you many other examples of how the narrative is aggressively promoted.
What about step parents? How did they fit in there? I know there is a very high percentage on those.
Yeah, I don't know the data about step parents, so I don't think, everything I tell you, I want to make sure it's
No,
based
I
on science and
understand.
data. So I don't know, I don't have the answer to that question.
Well, because people will try to pick apart everything you're saying because they don't want it to be true. We know how that goes. Or
Well,
either
I welcome that because I've been studying this research for 15 years, so I
that's right.
know it pretty darn well, and so I'm happy to have a thoughtful debate with anybody.
There you go. Speaking of that, Michael Hatfield said, "Where are the stats for coercive control from?"
Yeah. So, Michael, this comes from the CDC survey. Again, it's called the NISVS. And I'll tell you what that stands for. It's the National Intimate Partner and Violence Survey, NISVS. And there's a whole, they have questions specific to that. And I can give you the exact the name of the publication it comes from. So anyway, but it's from the NISVS.
Okay. And September 20th, I know you talked a little bit about that study that's coming up. Tell everybody where they can find that and some of the importance behind that study and some of the things they're going to be able to read.
Sure. So let me give you the URL for our website, and if you can, maybe you can type it in and display it on the screen.
Yes,
So
sir.
it's www.end2 as in TO dv.org. Again, end2dv.org. There it is. Okay. And I don't know if you can actually display our website on your screen or not, but across the top there's a banner, and one of them will say reports. And so if you click on that banner on September 20th, presto, you'll see our brand new report.
Gotcha. Now, how long have you guys been doing this, Edward?
Well, I've been involved in trying to fix the Violence Against Women Act for 15 years. So, and yeah, there's our website. And if you scroll back to the top, and in the really small type there, you can see home, about, and then reports. So that's where the report will be actually posted. So yeah, there it is. So yeah, I've been doing this for 15 years. I have to. I don't know if I can brag about that or not, but there are really not many people. When I talk to people on Capitol Hill, I say, well, I may be the only person you've ever met, but I've been involved in every reauthorization of VAWA since 2005.
Oh man, I thank you guys so much for your hard work. Are you seeing people start to become more receptive to it as time passes by?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's a definite shift. I remember when I was talking to people in 2005, or even 2012, some staffers were so incredibly hostile. They would sit behind, arms crossed, and they wouldn't ask any question. But I mean, they had such an air of hostility and sometimes arrogance, that it was pretty amazing. We don't see that now.
No, and when I started this, I've reached out to several different domestic violence organizations trying to get them on the show. We're against domestic violence too, if it's real domestic violence. At the same time, they need to be reporting these statistics and what's going on, knowing that false allegations does exist. But I've always said this, Ed, we're on the same team. The people that are making these false allegations and these false claims are the ones that's taken away the credibility for the actual victims. Nobody believes him anymore. It's like the boy who cried wolf.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, yeah, and that message is also sinking in gradually, but slowly but surely on Capitol Hill. So that's why your program is so very important to get this message out. And my encouragement and suggestion to your listeners is don't hesitate to speak out on these issues, whether it's posting comments on Facebook or Twitter, or testifying at the state legislature. It's just so important that we kind of get out of our shells and make the truth known.
That's right. When you got these studies that are coming up, any of the statistics that's coming up, please let us know. That's where you guys do what you do, and you're the best at it. We'll be here to report it. That's what we want to do with our show. And I am so glad I found you. I was actually making the documentary for John that got murdered, and I was looking up some of the statistics, and that's when I came across some of your studies, and I was like, oh my God, where have they been? Like, I need to talk to these guys. And it was refreshing, because you usually see the exact opposite. And I knew when I was reading it, I was like, we've got some substance here. How can people support your organization, and what are some of the things they can do? I don't know. Do you take volunteers or?
So, well, of course, we always are happy to receive contributions. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. All contributions are tax deductible, so we always welcome that. We are a policy organization. We are based in the Washington, D.C. area. We have a particular interest and concern about African American men, because all of the issues and problems we've been talking about are multiplied for African American men, like the issue of the arrests, the issue of false allegations,
the fatherless issue.
The fatherless. Every one of these issues are multiplied for African American men for a variety of reasons. But again, ironically, look at the actual science, and it turns out African American men are less likely to be perpetrators than African American women. So again, so we are particularly interested and concerned about how these laws have a disparate impact on African American men. So if any of your listeners have that as a particular interest, we are actually going to be very active on that front during the upcoming year, and be happy to hear from you.
Definitely, guys, get out there and make sure you support intodv.org. Ed, I cannot thank you enough for the very important work that you guys are doing. And you can believe I will be pushing it as hard as I can on my end. I know there's a lot of hard work that goes into that. And guys, we've got to change this narrative. It goes back to that narrative. Until that narrative is changed, we're kind of a hamster running on a wheel, because that narrative is so strong. It is so strong. I got people sometimes, we do a lot of these political conferences and we do a lot of these shows. They'll walk by and they'll see Dad on there. They're like, Dad. And they'll just start chuckling to themselves. And I'm like, that's not a laughing matter. The fatherless issue that we're facing, especially in the African-American households, it's getting out of hand. I think it's right around the mid 70s.
I believe that's correct. It's an absolute travesty. It's a, there's, I'm searching for the right word, and it's hard to find the right word, because, when you remove the father from the family, you're removing, that person is just as important as the mother for family stability, for child rearing, on track and on course. And if you don't think that's true, go to the low income communities in your neighborhood or in your state, and you'll notice right away the men are not with their children or with their wives. They're standing on a street corner, and that right there speaks volumes to the travesty that's been visited upon African American men.
Yeah, 100%. Ed, thank you so much. If you would stick around, I want to holler at you real quick when this show is over. But guys, September 20th, make sure to get out there and read that study. And any way we can help you, please let us know. All right. Hey everybody, Eric Carroll here. Thank you for tuning in to another exciting episode of Dad Talk Today. While we fight for you, we would ask for you to please help fight for us. Like, subscribe to our channel, and ring that bell so you get notifications every time we go live. There's also Super Chats, patreon.com/Dad Talk Today, and other ways you can support our channel. Thank you for being here, and we will see you next time.